A royal family's ambition permanently altered their own bone structure. For generations, the Habsburg rulers were marked by a strange and unmistakable feature, a protruding jaw so distinct it became their dynasty's visual signature. This is the story of the Habsburg Jaw, a real historical curse woven from politics, power, and hidden genetics. By the end, you will understand how a single family's strategy for global domination triggered a biological time bomb that reshaped faces and toppled kingdoms. We will uncover how modern science finally cracked this ancient mystery and explore why a royal chin became a symbol of tragic decay. What price do you think a dynasty pays for putting purity above all else? Their story begins not in grand palaces, but in a modest castle tucked away in the Swiss countryside. The Habsburgs were originally a minor noble family, their name taken from that first fortress, Habsburg or Hawk's Castle. Their rise was not the stuff of epic conquests or legendary battles. Instead, they mastered a quieter, more calculated art. While other kingdoms bled their armies dry on the battlefield, the Habsburgs played the long game with parchment and wedding vows. They built an empire not with swords but with signatures on marriage contracts. This strategy became their unofficial motto, a Latin phrase that perfectly captures their philosophy. Bella gerant alii, tu felix Austria nub. Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry, and marry they did with breathtaking precision. A Habsburg daughter wed to a king of Bohemia would bring that kingdom into the family's orbit. A Habsburg son marrying the heiress to Burgundy would claim those rich lands. Each union was a calculated move on a chessboard that spanned the continent. Through this relentless, generation-spanning matrimonial campaign, they accumulated titles and territories piece by piece. They became archdukes of Austria, kings of Hungary and Bohemia, and eventually the elected emperors of the Holy Roman Empire, a patchwork of hundreds of states across Central Europe. Their reach even extended across the ocean, with marriages granting them control of Spain and its vast New World colonies. From that small Swiss castle, they came to rule an empire where, famously, the sun never set. This strategy of marital accumulation was their genius, their superpower. It kept wealth and political influence circulating within an ever-tightening circle of European royalty. But this very practice, this insistence on marrying within a small, elite pool to consolidate power, contained the seed of a terrible paradox. The same closed network that fortified their political dynasty began to weaken their biological one. By constantly intermarrying cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, they were not just combining crowns and territories, they were also combining and concentrating the hidden genetic instructions carried in every family. Their greatest strength, keeping everything in the family, was quietly setting the stage for their most infamous legacy. The stage was now set for a biological drama centuries in the making. The consequences of this closed circle of power soon became visible on the faces of its rulers. Walk through any gallery of European royal portraits and the Habsburgs stand apart. Their features tell a story that goes beyond mere family resemblance, evolving into a distinct and unsettling physical signature. This was not a proud, strong jawline. It was a specific medical condition known as mandibular prognathism, where the lower jaw grows far forward of the upper jaw. In many portraits, you can see how the lower teeth jut out in front of the upper ones, even when the mouth is closed. This protruding jaw was often paired with a thick, everted lower lip that seemed to hang open, a feature sometimes called the Habsburg lip. Completing this distinctive look was a long, narrow nose and a drooping lower eyelid. Look at the face of Emperor Maximilian I, and you see the early blueprint. His jaw is prominent, his lip full. Then see his grandson, Charles V, whose jaw is so pronounced it alters the entire shape of his face. The trait grows more severe with each generation. King Philip IV of Spain, immortalized in paintings by Velázquez, displays the full array: the jutting chin, the heavy lip, the weary gaze. But the most tragic example is the last of the Spanish Habsburg line, Charles II. His portraits are heartbreaking. His jaw is so extremely protruded that his tongue reportedly did not fit properly in his mouth, making his speech nearly impossible to understand. His lower lip hung so low he could not close his mouth, leading to constant drooling. This was not a minor quirk. It was a debilitating deformity that affected the most basic human functions. Eating was a difficult, messy process. Clear speech was a struggle. At court, the king's appearance and his labored mumbling became sources of cruel whispers and mockery. Foreign ambassadors wrote home with detailed, unflattering descriptions, turning the monarch's face into an object of international pity and scorn. The very symbol of dynastic purity had become a mask of its profound weakness. So what was happening inside their bodies to sculpt these faces generation after generation? The portraits capture more than just a strange jawline. They are windows into bodies racked by a cascade of hidden ailments. The Habsburg jaw was merely the most visible flag of a sinking ship, the outward sign of a genetic system collapsing from within. For generations, the family suffered a horrifying catalogue of illnesses that whispered of a deeper curse. Infant mortality was staggeringly high, with many children dying before their first birthday from unknown weaknesses. Those who survived childhood often faced a lifetime of suffering. Epileptic seizures were common, striking down kings and princes without warning. Intellectual disabilities and learning difficulties appeared frequently, leaving some rulers ill-equipped for the complex demands of governance. Many Habsburgs were plagued by severe physical frailty, prone to constant illness and lacking the robust constitution expected of a warrior class. The living embodiment of this genetic tragedy was Charles II of Spain, known even in his own time as El Hechizado, the Bewitched. His problems began at birth, the product of generations of uncle-niece and cousin-cousin marriages. Charles was so genetically compromised that his body seemed to rebel against itself. He did not learn to walk until he was 8 years old. His speech was a garbled mumble, made worse by that monstrous jaw which made chewing nearly impossible. He was often fed a diet of soft, mashed foods. He suffered from frequent intestinal problems and debilitating illnesses that left him bedridden for weeks. Perhaps most crucially for a dynasty built on lineage, he was almost certainly impotent, unable to produce an heir despite 2 marriages. His court and all of Europe watched as this pitiable figure, the king of a vast empire, shuffled through his palaces, a prisoner in his own failing body. The curse was never one single thing. It was a syndrome, a perfect storm of recessive genetic disorders that had been duplicated and concentrated over centuries. The protruding jaw was simply the part you could see the symbolic crest on a coat of arms written in damaged DNA. It announced to the world that something was profoundly broken within the royal bloodline. To understand this biological unraveling, we need to step into the hidden world of genetics. Every person carries 2 sets of genetic instructions for every trait, one from each parent. Think of these instructions as tiny, invisible recipes written in a code only your body can read. Most of the time, if one recipe has a small error, the correct recipe from the other parent can cover for it, and no problem shows up. These hidden errors are called recessive genes. They can be instructions for anything from blue eyes to, unfortunately, a predisposition for certain health issues. They sit silently in a family line, passed down but unseen for generations. The trouble begins when 2 people who carry the same hidden error have a child. Suddenly, the child receives 2 copies of the faulty recipe, one from mom and one from dad. With no correct version to override it, the hidden trait finally becomes visible. This is the core mechanism of inbreeding depression. When a family tree begins to look more like a tangled vine, with cousins marrying cousins and uncles marrying nieces, the chance that both parents carry the same recessive gene skyrockets. They are, after all, drawing from the same shallow genetic pool. For European royalty, this was not an accident. It was policy. Marrying within a tiny, exclusive circle was seen as the only way to maintain the so-called purity of the bloodline, and more practically, to keep vast kingdoms and fabulous wealth from leaving the family. But with every royal wedding between close relatives, they were not just exchanging rings and crowns. They were doubling down on a genetic gamble, dramatically increasing the odds that any hidden flaws in their shared ancestry would come to light in their children. The protruding jaw, the severe illnesses, the tragic frailty of Charles II, these were not random acts of a curse. They were the almost mathematical certainty of recessive genes meeting again and again in a closed loop. The Habsburgs, in their quest for a pure and powerful dynasty, had unknowingly built a laboratory for genetic disaster. Centuries of speculation finally met modern science in a landmark 2019 study. A team of genetic detectives, led by Professor Roman Vilas, decided to treat the Habsburg mystery not as a historical curiosity, but as a solvable case. Their evidence was not DNA extracted from bones, at least not initially, but something equally revealing: the faces staring back from over 500 years of royal portraits. The researchers constructed an immense family tree spanning 16 generations of Habsburgs, from the founder of the dynasty's fortune, Emperor Frederick III, all the way to the tragic Charles II of Spain. For each ruler, they performed a remarkable feat of long-distance diagnosis. Using dozens of reliable portraits, they scored the severity of two distinct facial features. The first was the obvious one, mandibular prognathism, that famous jutting lower jaw. The second was a less obvious but equally important trait called maxillary deficiency, where the upper jaw and cheekbones are underdeveloped, creating a sunken, narrow appearance in the middle of the face. They gave each Habsburg ruler a numerical score for how pronounced these features were. Then came the crucial step. For each person on that vast family tree, the scientists calculated a number called the coefficient of inbreeding. This is a precise genetic measure, a percentage that answers a simple, haunting question: how closely related were this person's parents? A coefficient of 0 means the parents were totally unrelated. But the number climbs higher as the family ties tighten: first cousins, uncle and niece, and so on. When they plotted the facial deformity scores against the inbreeding coefficients, the data told a clear and powerful story. The correlation was strong and statistically undeniable. Habsburgs with the highest inbreeding coefficients, meaning their parents were the most closely related, consistently had the most severe jaw deformities. This was the smoking gun. The Habsburg jaw was not a random quirk or a sign of divine disfavor. It was a classic recessive genetic trait, its instructions hidden in the family line for generations, waiting to be unmasked when two carriers married. The portraits had held the truth all along, a silent testimony written in bone and paint, now decoded by science. But this revelation about the past would soon connect to a much more personal tool for understanding our own histories. To truly grasp the genetic trap the Habsburgs built, we need to look at their family tree. A healthy family tree should look like a mighty oak with branches spreading wide and reaching out to new genetic horizons. The Habsburg tree, however, looks more like a tangled, gnarled vine, its branches twisting back in on themselves in a closed loop. This visual tells the story of pedigree collapse, a chilling term for a simple fact. When families intermarry, the number of unique ancestors a person has doesn't just grow slowly, it can actually shrink. Instead of having 4 distinct grandparents, you might have 3 or even 2, because the same ancestors appear in multiple places on your family chart. For the Habsburgs, this wasn't an occasional slip, it was their standard operating procedure. Take the pivotal union of Philip the Handsome and Joanna the Mad. They weren't just royals from neighboring kingdoms, they were double first cousins once removed, sharing a dense thicket of common ancestors. Their marriage fused two already interwoven branches of the family, and their children became the primary genetic stock for the next century of European rule. From this point forward, the family tree becomes a dizzying maze of recursive loops. Uncles married nieces, first cousins married each other. The Spanish and Austrian branches of the family constantly exchanged spouses, not bringing in new blood, but just recirculating the same old genes. The result was a dramatic narrowing of the genetic pool, a funnel that concentrated both power and peril into fewer and fewer individuals. This brings us to the tragic endpoint of this experiment, Charles II. Modern geneticists have calculated his coefficient of inbreeding, and the number is staggering. It was 0.25, which is a scientific way of saying his family tree had collapsed into a thicket of repetition. This number is higher than what you would expect if his own parents had been brother and sister. Think about that for a moment. Through generations of strategic cousin marriages, the Habsburgs created a king who was genetically more inbred than the child of a single act of sibling marriage. In practical terms, this meant Charles had very few truly unique genetic contributors in his ancestry. The same royal faces, the same hidden genetic instructions, appeared over and over in his lineage until the odds of inheriting two copies of any harmful recessive trait became a near certainty. His entire being was a monument to pedigree collapse, a living testament to what happens when a dynasty confuses purity with poison. While the study confirmed the Jaw's link to inbreeding, it left a crucial question unanswered. What specific genetic instructions exactly went wrong? The researchers proved the how, the recessive inheritance pattern, but the precise what remains a historical medical mystery, hidden within the unreadable DNA of long-buried kings. Without genetic samples from the Habsburgs themselves, scientists can only speculate by matching their described symptoms to known disorders we understand today. One strong candidate is a group of conditions known as mandibulofacial dysystoses. These are genetic disorders that specifically disrupt the intricate blueprint for building the lower face and jaw in the womb. The hallmark features read like a checklist for the Habsburg portrait gallery: a severely underdeveloped upper jaw and cheekbones, a prominent and protruding lower jaw, a drooping lower eyelid, and even malformed ears. It fits the visual evidence almost perfectly, but there are other possibilities on the table. Some historians and medical experts have pointed toward hormonal disorders. Could a malfunctioning pituitary gland, the body's master hormone regulator, have been the culprit? A condition called acromegaly, caused by an excess of growth hormone in adulthood, can lead to a progressive thickening and enlargement of the jawbone, along with those characteristically broadened facial features. Yet, this doesn't quite align with the Habsburg portraits, which often show the distinctive jaw present from youth, not developing later in life. Others suggest a more complex picture. Perhaps it wasn't one single gene, but a perfect storm of several recessive traits affecting bone growth and hormone receptors, all converging in one family line through relentless inbreeding. This combination could have created a unique syndrome seen nowhere else, a Habsburg-specific recipe for facial deformity. The frustrating and fascinating truth is we may never know the exact genetic code behind the jaw. The portraits give us the symptoms, the family tree gives us the cause, but the specific biological mechanism is lost to time. This lingering uncertainty reminds us that some historical diagnoses remain just beyond our reach, their final secrets locked in bones we may never test. Yet, even without that final piece, the lesson is devastatingly clear. This relentless intermarriage was never about love or even mere tradition. It was cold, hard political calculus. In a Europe fractured into hundreds of competing states, a royal marriage was the ultimate peace treaty, the most binding alliance, and a property transaction of staggering scale. The Habsburgs did not just marry for power, they married for real estate. Every union was designed to stitch together another patch of the continental quilt under their black double-headed eagle. Consider the monumental inheritance of Charles V. He did not conquer his empire, he inherited it through a series of brilliantly arranged marriages. His grandfather, Maximilian, married Mary of Burgundy, bringing the wealthy Low Countries, modern-day Belgium and the Netherlands, into the family. His other set of grandparents, Ferdinand and Isabella, united Spain. Then Charles's parents, Philip and Joanna, fused these Burgundian and Spanish lines together. With one final inheritance from his Habsburg grandfather, Charles found himself ruler of territories spanning from Spain and its New World silver mines to Austria, from Italy to the Netherlands. It was an empire assembled by matrimony, not militaries. The imperative was always consolidation and containment. Vast lands and royal titles were treated as indivisible heirlooms that must never leave the family's grasp. Marrying a cousin or a niece was seen as the safest way to achieve this. It kept the crowns on familiar heads and the treasure in a closed vault. Bringing in an outside spouse from France or England was a risk. It could mean lands eventually passing to a rival dynasty through inheritance. Better to keep the bloodline pure and the assets locked down, even if that bloodline was growing dangerously shallow. The marriage of Philip II to his niece, Anna of Austria, is a perfect, chilling example of this logic in action. Philip was already King of Spain, Portugal, Naples, and Sicily, and Lord of the Netherlands. Anna was the daughter of his sister. This was not a romantic match, but a strategic recycling of Habsburg genes to produce a Spanish heir who would have no competing claims from a foreign father. It worked in the narrowest sense. Their son, Philip III, was born, but he and the son that followed him would carry the accumulated genetic toll of generations of such unions straight to the tragic figure of Charles II. The tragic irony is breathtaking. The same marriage contracts that built a global empire, that consolidated kingdoms and funneled gold into their coffers, were also quietly signing a biological death warrant for their own lineage. They were playing a game of dynastic chess, thinking dozens of moves ahead on the political board, while remaining utterly blind to the genetic board where their pieces were being systematically doomed. Their greatest political strength became their fatal biological flaw. Behind the glittering titles and majestic portraits lay a world of private agony. For these kings and emperors, the Habsburg Jaw was not a historical footnote but a daily, humiliating prison. Consider the mighty Charles V, upon whose empire the sun never set. The same protruding jaw that looked formidable in portraits made the simple act of speaking a constant struggle. His words were often mumbled and difficult to understand, a profound handicap for a ruler who needed to command armies, negotiate with cunning diplomats, and project absolute authority. Historians now believe this chronic frustration, this inability to communicate clearly, was a key source of his legendary and explosive temper. The man who controlled continents could not control the clarity of his own speech, a private torment that undoubtedly fueled his public rages. But if Charles V's life was shaped by frustration, his descendant Charles II's existence was defined by unrelenting suffering. His deformities went far beyond the jaw. His tongue was so abnormally large it did not fit in his mouth, leading to constant, embarrassing drooling that no royal handkerchief could fully conceal. He suffered from rickets, a bone-softening disease that left his legs too weak to support him until he was 8 years old, and even as an adult he was often carried in a litter. His digestive system was a source of perpetual agony, and he was plagued by epileptic seizures and terrifying hallucinations. He was convinced he was indeed bewitched. His court moved him from palace to palace in a desperate attempt to escape the demons he believed pursued him. The psychological toll of this existence is almost impossible to overstate. Imagine the weight of knowing your own face, the very symbol of your divine right to rule, is the subject of cruel jokes in foreign courts and fearful whispers in your own halls. Every portrait session, every public appearance was a reminder of your difference. Your body, which should be a vessel of strength and command, is instead a source of weakness and ridicule. You are a king who cannot chew his food properly, who speaks in a slushy mumble, who is carried like a child. The gilded cage of the monarchy, built to display power, became a showcase for profound vulnerability. This is the true heart of the story, not just a genetic condition, but the human experience of living within its constraints, where every golden privilege was shadowed by a very personal curse. But how do you govern an empire when your own face becomes a political liability? The Habsburgs were masters of image management long before the term existed, and they deployed their greatest artists as the first line of defense. In the Spanish court, Diego Velázquez faced a delicate, almost impossible task. As court painter to King Philip IV and later to the tragically deformed Charles II, his job was to portray divine majesty, not human frailty. His genius lay in his subtlety. Look at his portraits of Charles. The lighting is soft, often falling gently on the young king's ornate costumes and the symbols of his office, the baton of command, the sword of state. Velázquez directs our eye to the luxurious fabrics and the solemn, regal pose, yet he does not erase the truth. That distinctive, protruding lower lip is still there. The jaw is still prominent, the gaze distant, but it is framed with such dignity and such technical brilliance that the viewer feels a somber pity rather than outright horror. It was a careful balancing act, an honest enough representation to be credible, but softened enough to maintain the aura of kingship. This was art in service of dynasty, a visual argument for legitimacy painted in oil and shadow. Across the border, however, their enemies wielded a far cruder brush. In the Netherlands, which was fighting a brutal war of independence from Spanish Habsburg rule, printers churned out propaganda pamphlets for a hungry public. These were not dignified portraits, they were savage caricatures that transformed the Habsburg Jaw from a physical trait into a moral and political indictment. The Spanish rulers were depicted not as kings but as monstrous subhuman creatures. Their jaws were exaggerated into beast-like muzzles. Their lips were drawn as slobbering, bestial flaps. They were shown wearing fool's caps or surrounded by symbols of greed and tyranny. This was biology weaponized. By distorting the royal face, the propagandists argued that the entire dynasty was degenerate, unfit to rule, and literally inhuman. The message was clear: a body so corrupted could not possibly govern a healthy state. The French, perpetual rivals to Habsburg power, eagerly adopted the same tactic. Their cartoons portrayed the Habsburgs as drooling, mindless grotesques, their famous jaws a sign of brutishness and intellectual decay. In one particularly infamous French print, the Habsburg lineage was depicted as a procession of ape-like figures, each with a more absurdly extended jaw than the last, marching toward oblivion. This was more than mockery, it was psychological warfare. By attacking the monarch's physical form, they undermined the very foundation of royal authority, which was rooted in the belief that kings were God's chosen, set apart and above ordinary men. If a king looked like a monster, how could he be divine? This intersection of biology, art, and perception created a powerful feedback loop. The real genetic consequences of inbreeding provided the raw material. Court art tried desperately to sanitize it. Enemy propaganda ruthlessly amplified it. In the public mind, the Habsburg Jaw ceased to be a medical condition. It became a symbol, a shorthand for a dynasty that had grown so inward, so obsessed with its own purity, that it had become alien and repellent to the world it sought to control. The face of the king was now the face of the empire's decay. The culmination of this genetic tragedy arrived with the reign of Charles II. From the moment he was proclaimed king at the age of 4, the Spanish court knew it was ruling on behalf of a ghost. His physical ailments were only part of the story. He was described as possessing a childlike intellect, prone to deep melancholy and sudden, superstitious fears. He could barely read or write, and affairs of state were an incomprehensible mystery to him. Power did not reside with the king, but swirled around him in a toxic vortex of competing factions. His mother, various royal uncles, and foreign ambassadors all formed shifting alliances, each trying to control the hollow figure at the center to advance their own agendas. The government became paralyzed, a ship with a dozen captains and no one at the wheel. But the most pressing crisis, the one that kept every European court holding its breath, was the question of an heir. Two marriages, first to a French princess and then to an Austrian one, produced no children. The royal bedchamber was a place of political scrutiny and profound failure. The curse had achieved its ultimate dynastic sabotage. It had rendered the king sterile. As his health deteriorated and his bizarre behaviors intensified, a desperate explanation took hold. The king and the nation became convinced he was literally bewitched El Hechizado. They believed a curse had been placed upon him at birth to prevent the Habsburg line from continuing. What followed was a macabre chapter of medieval superstition crashing against a modern political crisis. Exorcisms were performed, holy relics were applied to his frail body. In a ghastly final attempt, the corpse of his long-dead first wife was exhumed so he could embrace it, a ritual meant to break the spell. None of it worked. When Charles finally died in November of 1700, he left a will that named a successor, but he left no son. The direct male line of the Spanish Habsburgs, a dynasty that had ruled for nearly 2 centuries, was extinguished with a final, shuddering breath. His death did not bring quiet mourning, but the roar of cannons. The vacuum he left behind ignited the War of the Spanish Succession, a brutal, continent-wide conflict that lasted for 13 years. Nearly every major power in Europe joined the fight over who would inherit the shattered Spanish Empire. It was a war born directly from a biological dead end. The Habsburg Jaw, that visible mark of inward-looking pride, had finally accomplished what no foreign army ever could. It erased a royal line from the earth and plunged a continent into fire. While the Spanish branch withered and died, their Austrian cousins watched from Vienna with a growing sense of dread. They had witnessed the catastrophic result of their shared family strategy, and a chilling question hung in the air: were they next? The Austrian Habsburgs faced a stark choice: continue the old ways and risk the same fate, or find a way to break the cycle. Their survival hinged on a delicate, partial pivot. They could not abandon the concept of strategic marriage, the very engine of their dynasty, but they could widen the pool just a little. Instead of the relentless cousin marriages that had defined the Spanish line, the Austrians began to look to the numerous princely houses of the Holy Roman Empire. They married German princesses from families like Bavaria and Saxony, introducing fragments of new genetic material. This was not a revolution, but a cautious reform. The most famous and consequential of these unions was that of the formidable Empress Maria Theresa. She did not marry a close cousin, but Francis Stephen, the Duke of Lorraine. This match was a masterstroke of both politics and, unintentionally, genetics. Politically, it brought the valuable territory of Lorraine into the Habsburg orbit and founded the new Habsburg-Lorraine dynasty. Genetically, Francis Stephen was a true outsider, with no recent common ancestors with Maria Theresa. For the first time in centuries, a major Habsburg heir would be the product of what we might call a genetically healthy marriage. The effects were visible on the faces of their many children. Look at portraits of their son, Emperor Joseph II, or their daughter, the ill-fated Queen Marie Antoinette of France. The monstrous, protruding Habsburg jaw is gone. Their features are balanced, even handsome, by contemporary standards. The extreme facial deformity that had cursed their Spanish relatives for 200 years had, within a single generation, dramatically receded. It seemed the curse was broken, but genetics is rarely so simple. While the most visible marker faded, the deeper legacy of inbreeding did not vanish overnight. The Austrian branch had diluted their gene pool, but they had not flushed it clean. Harmful recessive genes carried silently for generations could still find each other. This lingering shadow revealed itself not in jaws but in other afflictions. epilepsy, a known consequence of close inbreeding, continued to haunt the family. Maria Theresa's own son, Emperor Joseph II, suffered from it. Other descendants faced severe physical weaknesses, intellectual challenges, and heartbreaking rates of child mortality. The case of Maria Theresa's grandson, Emperor Ferdinand I of Austria, is particularly telling. He was born with what was then called hydrocephalus and suffered from severe epilepsy and cognitive difficulties that made him incapable of ruling. His parents were first cousins, a throwback to the old pattern that reintroduced concentrated risks. So, did the Austrian Habsburgs escape the curse? The answer is a nuanced one. They escaped its most grotesque and iconic symbol. By opening the marital gates, even just a crack, they prevented the total genetic collapse that doomed their Spanish cousins. But they could not outrun centuries of accumulated risk in a single lifetime. The ghost of their ancestral choices lingered in the form of seizures, fragility, and tragedy. Their story is one of mitigation, not liberation, a powerful lesson that even a small step toward genetic diversity can pull a family back from the brink, but the echoes of the past can whisper for generations. The Habsburgs were not alone in their genetic isolation. History is filled with dynasties that, in their quest to preserve power within a sacred bloodline, inadvertently cultivated their own biological curses. Look to the sun-baked banks of the Nile, to the Ptolemaic pharaohs who ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years. To maintain their Greek identity and divine status, they repeatedly married brother to sister, uncle to niece, in a closed loop even more extreme than the Habsburgs. Cleopatra VII, the most famous of their line, was the product of generations of such unions. While celebrated for her intellect and political cunning, this intense inbreeding likely contributed to the frequent health problems, high infant mortality, and eventual extinction of her dynasty. Their power was absolute, but their gene pool was a stagnant pond. Closer to the Habsburgs' own time, the glittering court of Versailles harbored its own hidden frailties. The Bourbon kings of France, while not practicing cousin marriage to the same relentless degree, were still part of that tightly interwoven European royal network. Many historians and medical experts have examined the puzzling condition of King Louis XVI. His difficulties in consummating his marriage to Marie Antoinette for 7 long years have been attributed by some to a physical anomaly, possibly a hormonal condition like a pituitary disorder. While not a classic case of mandibular prognathism, such issues can be linked to the same kind of recessive genetic inheritance that flourishes in limited gene pools. The Bourbons' struggles with health and fertility whispered of the same underlying principle. When you draw partners from the same small, elite circle for centuries, you roll the genetic dice with increasingly dangerous odds. Perhaps the most famous royal genetic marker of the modern era is hemophilia, the royal disease that bled through the courts of Europe. This story begins with Queen Victoria of England. She was almost certainly a spontaneous carrier of the mutation for hemophilia, a disorder that impairs blood clotting. Because she had 9 children who married into nearly every major royal house, Russia, Germany, Spain, she single-handedly spread this hidden trait across the continent. Her son Leopold suffered from it and died young. Most tragically, her granddaughter Alexandra, who married Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, passed the gene to their son Alexei. His severe hemophilia became a state secret and a source of immense family trauma, drawing the mystic Rasputin into the heart of the Romanov court and contributing to the dynasty's fatal aura of crisis and decay. Here, the mechanism was different. It was a dominant queen spreading a new mutation, not centuries of cousin marriage concentrating old ones, but the outcome was the same, a biological flaw woven into the fabric of royalty, shaping history and toppling thrones. So what do these stories tell us? The Habsburg Jaw is the starkest, most visually arresting example of a pattern that repeats wherever power becomes insular. Whether it is the protruding chins in Madrid, the sibling marriages in Alexandria, the suspected ailments in Versailles, or the bleeding disorder in St. Petersburg, the lesson is consistent. When a ruling class isolates itself genetically, treating its own blood as too pure to mix, it builds a biological prison. The very thing meant to ensure strength and continuity, exclusive lineage, becomes the source of fatal weakness. These dynasties did not understand the science, but they lived with the consequences: sickly heirs, childless kings, and a creeping sense that their divine right was somehow cursed. Their tragedies were not acts of fate, but the predictable results of a dangerous social equation where political ambition blinded them to biological reality. The story of the Habsburgs did not end with their thrones. It migrated from the palace to the clinic, from history books to medical textbooks. Their most infamous feature achieved a strange kind of immortality, becoming permanent terminology in the language of medicine. To this day, doctors and geneticists around the world still use the terms Habsburg Jaw and Habsburg Lip. These are not casual nicknames, but specific clinical descriptors. Habsburg Jaw refers to a particularly severe and characteristic form of mandibular prognathism, where the lower jaw's forward growth is pronounced and often accompanied by that specific underdevelopment of the upper jaw. Habsburg Lip describes the distinct, full, everted lower lip that seemed to hang open in so many portraits. When a medical student opens a textbook on craniofacial disorders or clinical genetics, they are likely to encounter the faces of Charles V or Philip IV staring back at them, not as kings, but as classic case studies. The Habsburgs have become the archetype, the go-to historical example of what happens when recessive genetic traits are concentrated through generations of consanguineous marriage, or marriage between close blood relatives. Their lineage provides a clear, documented, and visually stark illustration of a principle that is otherwise explained with abstract Punnett squares and dry statistics. They put a human face, however distorted, on a complex genetic concept. This enduring relevance means the dynasty's legacy is twofold. They left behind palaces and paintings, but they also left behind a cautionary tale written in bone structure, one that continues to educate new generations of scientists. Their story is a bridge connecting a dark chapter of royal politics to the bright light of modern genetic understanding, proving that sometimes the most powerful lessons in biology are written not in lab reports, but in the tragic contours of a human face. The curse was never a bolt of divine lightning. It was a slow, silent accumulation. One of the most persistent myths is that a single wicked ancestor or a terrible sin brought this fate upon the family. Folklore might point to a specific act of treachery or a broken vow, but genetics does not work on a ledger of cosmic justice. The Habsburg Jaw was not a punishment but a consequence. There was no original sinner in a genetic story like this, only a long line of people making the same strategic choice, unaware of the biological price tag. The flaw was not in their morals but in their marriage contracts. Each union between cousins was like adding another scoop of sand to one side of a scale. For generations, nothing seemed to happen. The scale held. But with enough repetitions, the weight became undeniable and the scale tipped, revealing the hidden burden that had been building all along. The outcome felt like a curse because it was so devastating and so clearly linked to their behavior, but its mechanism was cold, mechanical, and utterly natural. Another common misunderstanding is that every Habsburg ruler was a carbon copy of Charles II, drooling and deformed. The reality is far more nuanced, and the portraits show it. The trait's expression existed on a spectrum. Look at the early Habsburgs like Frederick III or Maximilian I. Their jaws are strong, perhaps prominent, but not yet grotesque. They commanded respect. The deformity grew more pronounced as the inbreeding coefficient climbed in later generations. Even then, severity varied. Philip IV had the distinct jaw and lip, yet he ruled for decades, a patron of the arts and fathered children. His son, Charles II, represented the extreme end of that spectrum, the point where the accumulated genetic load became utterly debilitating. This variation is the key to understanding it as a recessive trait. Not every child of closely related parents will express the condition with the same intensity because genetics involves chance. Some might inherit a different combination of the problematic genes or have other modifying factors that lessen the impact. The curse was not a uniform stamp, but a shadow that grew longer and darker with each generation that refused to step into the light of new genetic horizons. Perhaps the most important correction is to the very word curse. It implies an external, supernatural force, a spell, a hex, a divine judgment. This framing lets us off the hook. It makes the tragedy seem like an act of fate, something outside of human control. The Habsburg story is powerful precisely because it is the opposite. It is a story of human agency, of choices made with clear political intent leading to unintended biological ruin. They were not victims of a mystical affliction, they were architects of their own genetic bottleneck. Calling it a curse romanticizes the truth. The truth is more sobering and more instructive. It shows us that when societies, whether royal families or isolated communities, prize purity and closed borders above all else, they are not preserving strength. They are conducting a long-term experiment with very predictable and often tragic results. The Habsburg Jaw is not a ghost story. It is a case study written in bone and portrait of how ideology can shape biology and how the greatest threats to a dynasty can sometimes be bred within its own walls. Their story forces us to confront a difficult moral question. What is the greater responsibility for those in power, to secure the state today or to safeguard the well-being of those who will inherit it tomorrow? For the Habsburgs, the answer was clear and immediate. Every marriage was a geopolitical tool, a way to prevent war, secure a border, or bankrupt a rival. The health of a future king's jaw or the risk of his epilepsy seemed a distant, abstract concern compared to the urgent need for a stable alliance. They were playing a game with the pieces they had on the board, and the most valuable pieces were their own children. The ethical framework of their time offered no warning. Genetics was an unknown science. The idea that marrying a niece could doom a great-grandson to a life of suffering was simply not within their understanding. Theirs was a calculus of power, not of pedigree health. Yet, even without the science, a basic human instinct was being overridden. The choice to repeatedly marry within the same tiny family circle, to see your own relatives not just as kin but as the only suitable partners, speaks to a deeper ideology. It reflects a belief that their blood was so superior, so sacred, that diluting it with outside stock was a greater risk than any physical consequence. This was the ultimate expression of elitism codified into biology. They prioritized political and racial purity over the fundamental biological wisdom that diversity brings strength. Today, our understanding has flipped this equation on its head. Modern genetics has shown us the clear dangers of consanguineous marriage, and most cultures have strong social and legal taboos against it. We see it not as a strategy for purity, but as a risk to health. The ethical dilemma the Habsburgs faced has, in a way, been resolved by knowledge. We now know that the stability of a realm or any community is profoundly linked to the genetic health of its people. A king who cannot speak, an heir who cannot be born, these are not personal tragedies alone, they are national crises. The Habsburgs, in their relentless pursuit of a closed system, demonstrated this truth in the most devastating way possible. Their cautionary tale echoes far beyond the throne room. It resonates wherever groups seek to isolate themselves, to draw a circle around power or identity, and declare that nothing from outside may enter. Whether it is in the rigid caste systems of history, the closed circles of certain aristocratic societies, or even in the modern rhetoric of ethnic or ideological purity, the same dangerous logic appears. It is the belief that strength comes from exclusion, that purity is the same as power. The Habsburg Jaw stands as a monumental rebuttal to that idea. It is physical proof that isolation does not preserve, it corrupts. That a system which refuses new ideas, new people, and new genetic material is not protecting its future but mortgaging it. The bones of their kings tell us that the greatest threat to a dynasty's survival was not the army at the gates, but the narrowing of the very gene pool they fought so hard to keep pure. So where does that leave our sense of responsibility? Their story suggests that leadership in any age carries a duty to look beyond the immediate political horizon. It asks us to consider the long-term consequences of our social structures and our choices about who belongs. The Habsburgs made their choice for reasons that made perfect sense in their moment, and they paid a price they never could have imagined. It is a haunting reminder that the maps we use to navigate the present are often tragically incomplete, missing the most important terrain of all, the unseen landscape of the future. Their portraits offer one kind of evidence, but the most direct testimony lies in the tombs themselves. The physical remains of the Habsburgs rest in two magnificent and somber locations, holding silent answers to questions we are only now learning how to ask. In Spain, the kings and queens of the Habsburg line are interred within the royal monastery of San Lorenzo de El Escorial, a vast granite complex that is both palace and pantheon. Their bodies lie in the cold, austere grandeur of the royal pantheon, a chamber of dark marble and gold. Across Europe, in the heart of Vienna, the Austrian Habsburgs rest in the imperial crypt beneath the Capuchin church. For centuries, this has been their final resting place, a labyrinth of ornate sarcophagi containing the bones of emperors, empresses, and archdukes. These are not just tourist sites, they are archives written in bone. Imagine what a detailed examination of these skeletal remains could tell us. Physical anthropologists could take precise measurements of the actual skulls, mapping the exact dimensions of that famous jaw with a level of accuracy no portrait can provide. They could look for signs of other skeletal disorders linked to inbreeding evidence of rickets, which softened the bones, or unusual spinal deformities. They could analyze the teeth for patterns of wear and disease, offering clues about the chronic difficulties with chewing and speech described in historical accounts. The bones themselves might hold the story of a lifetime of pain and physical limitation, but the greatest potential lies deeper at the molecular level. Within those centuries-old bones, fragments of ancient DNA may still survive, locked away in the dense core of the teeth or the petrous bone of the skull. While no such genetic study has been published on the Habsburg remains, these are still the tombs of revered historical figures, and access is rightly guarded. The possibility hangs in the air like a promise for future science. One day, with careful permission and non-destructive techniques, scientists might extract and sequence that DNA. This would be the ultimate key. It could allow researchers to move beyond correlation and finally identify the specific genetic mutations responsible. Was it a fault in a gene governing jaw development, a cluster of recessive disorders affecting bone growth hormones? The DNA could confirm the presence of known conditions or reveal a unique Habsburg-specific syndrome lost to time. Such a discovery would close the loop on a mystery that has captivated historians and scientists for generations. It would transform the Habsburgs from a historical case study into a precise genetic map, showing us exactly which biological switches were flipped by their relentless matrimonial strategy. Until that day comes, their remains rest in dignified silence, holding the final chapter of their story in trust. They are a reminder that history is not just recorded in documents, but is also etched into the very skeleton of the past, waiting for the future to learn its language. That silent testimony in the tombs finds a loud, colorful echo on our screens today. The Habsburg Jaw has escaped the history books to become a powerful visual symbol in popular culture, a ready-made shorthand for writers and filmmakers wanting to depict a dynasty in decline. In the Spanish historical adventure series The Ministry of Time, the character of King Charles II is portrayed with clear prosthetic makeup to emphasize his distinctive features, his appearance serving as a constant, unsettling reminder of the price of his lineage. Similarly, the film A la Triste, starring Viggo Mortensen and set in the era of Philip IV, does not shy away from showing the king's pronounced jaw and lip, using the monarch's very face to mirror the crumbling grandeur of the Spanish Empire. These are not casual details, they are deliberate choices that tell the audience without a single line of exposition that this royal bloodline has grown strange and weak. The deformed jaw becomes a costume piece, a prop that instantly communicates centuries of insular pride and biological consequence. It translates a complex genetic story into an image anyone can understand, a corrupted king for a decaying kingdom. This trope resonates far beyond strict historical drama. Look at the sprawling, fictional dynasties of Westeros in Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon. The writers did not need to invent the concept of royal inbreeding causing physical and mental decay. They simply borrowed it from history's playbook. The Targaryens, with their platinum hair and purple eyes, practice brother-sister marriage to keep the bloodline pure. And what are the consequences? We see them vividly. King Ares II, the Mad King, descends into paranoia and pyromania. His son, Prince Regal, is described as soft-bodied and simple. Viserys Targaryen exhibits escalating cruelty and instability. The show visually codes this decay not in a jutting jaw specifically, but in pale, almost alien beauty that masks a terrifying potential for madness and physical frailty. The message is the same as the one whispered in the courts of Madrid. A family that closes in on itself will eventually produce monsters. It is the Habsburg template adapted for fantasy, proving that this real history narrative of self-inflicted dynastic collapse remains a compelling story engine. It satisfies a deep-seated cultural intuition that extreme privilege and isolation must somehow manifest in the body. This cultural recycling does something fascinating. It turns a medical condition into a metaphor. In the public imagination now, the Habsburg jaw is less about recessive genes and more about the inevitable rot of unchecked power. It signifies that a family has been at the top for too long, that it has grown stagnant, that its greatest enemy is no longer outside the gates but in its own mirror. When a filmmaker puts that jaw on a king, they are telling us this ruler is the end of a line, a biological dead end. This connection makes a dense academic topic viscerally relatable. A viewer might not remember the coefficient of inbreeding for Charles II, but they will remember his face from a show or a film, and they will understand the tragic story it tells. In this way, the Habsburgs' curse continues to shape stories, reminding us that the most haunting tales are often those where the villain is not a person, but a principle. The dangerous idea that purity is more important than health, that blood must never be mixed, and that some walls, built to keep the world out, ultimately serve only to seal a dynasty's fate within. But history, like a face, is rarely shaped by a single force. While the genetic evidence is compelling, a growing chorus of historians urges caution against letting the Habsburg jaw dominate the entire story. They argue that focusing solely on inbreeding can become a form of biological determinism, reducing the complex downfall of a dynasty to a simple matter of bad genes. This perspective invites us to widen the lens and consider the toxic environment in which these royals lived. For instance, the childhood of a Habsburg prince was often a gilded cage of profound neglect. Isolated in vast, drafty palaces, they were frequently raised by teams of servants following rigid, outdated protocols. Their diets, while lavish, could be strangely deficient in crucial nutrients needed for proper bone development. Rickets, a disease caused by vitamin D deficiency, was rampant among European aristocracy, leading to soft, bowed legs and skeletal deformities, a condition that could easily be mistaken for or compounded by genetic weaknesses. Then there were the invisible poisons woven into the fabric of their luxury. The brilliant white lead makeup used to achieve the fashionable pallor of royalty was slowly absorbed through the skin, causing neurological damage, cognitive decline, and organ failure. The exquisite glazes on their fine china and drinking vessels often contained lead as well, leaching into their food and wine over a lifetime. Chronic lead poisoning alone can cause a host of symptoms eerily similar to those described in the Habsburgs: gout, severe abdominal pain, erratic behavior, and even intellectual impairment. Furthermore, they lived in an age of constant, rampant disease. Smallpox, malaria, and typhoid fever swept through courts without warning, scarring survivors and weakening constitutions. A king like Charles II, who suffered a terrifying list of ailments from epilepsy to digestive failure, may have been the victim of multiple assaults on his health. His genetic inheritance merely set the stage, but these environmental factors were the actors that brought the tragedy to life. The most compelling counterpoint asks a simple question: were the Habsburgs truly unique in their suffering? Other European rulers from the same period, whose family trees were not nearly as tangled, exhibited similar clusters of poor health, mental instability, and high child mortality. This suggests that being a European monarch in the 16th or 17th century was in itself a significant health risk, regardless of your parents' relation. So, where does this leave our understanding of the curse? It points us toward a more nuanced and perhaps more frightening conclusion. The Habsburgs may not have been doomed by their DNA alone, but by a perfect storm of detrimental factors. Their genetic predisposition, born of political strategy, made them uniquely vulnerable. Then, the poisonous trappings of their supreme status, the lead, the poor childhood care, the ever-present diseases acted upon that vulnerability with devastating effect. It was the collision of nature and a deeply toxic nurture. To see only the jaw is to miss the full portrait of their decline, a masterpiece painted with many brushes, each dipped in a different kind of peril. The slow poison of their choices did not stop with the death of a single king. It seeped into the very foundations of their empire, weakening its structure for the final political collapse that would follow centuries later. Even as the Austrian branch diluted the most visible signs of the curse, the political world they had built through marriage was beginning to fracture under new, unstoppable forces. The first great pillar to fall was the ancient Holy Roman Empire, that patchwork of German states they had dominated for so long. By the early 1800s, it was a hollow relic. The seismic shockwaves of the French Revolution and the military genius of Napoleon Bonaparte redrew the map of Europe through force, not matrimony. In 1806, the Habsburg Emperor Francis II was forced to dissolve the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. To preserve a royal title for himself, he had already declared the Austrian Empire 2 years earlier. It was a profound symbolic end. The political entity whose crown they had worn for nearly 4 centuries, the very reason for so many of their strategic marriages, simply ceased to exist. The era of building empires with wedding vows was over, replaced by the age of nationalism and cannon fire. Yet the Habsburgs proved resilient, adapting their shape to survive. Their next act was one of brilliant, desperate political theater. By the mid-1800s, nationalist fervor was tearing at the seams of their multi-ethnic empire. The Hungarians, in particular, demanded recognition and autonomy. The result was the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867. It transformed the unitary Austrian Empire into the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. They were now 2 separate, equal states sharing a single monarch who would be crowned both Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary. It was a masterful delay tactic, a constitutional marriage of convenience that bought the dynasty another 50 years. Under the long reign of Emperor Francis Joseph, who ruled for an astonishing 68 years, the empire entered a final golden autumn. Vienna became a dazzling capital of music, art, and intellectual ferment, while Budapest flourished as a majestic second capital. The dynasty seemed to have weathered the storm, trading absolute control for a fragile, glittering coexistence, but the underlying pressures never ceased. The empire was a volatile mosaic of over a dozen major ethnic groups: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Ukrainians, Romanians, Croats, Serbs, and more, each increasingly yearning for their own nation. The Habsburgs, whose very identity was built on transcendent dynastic loyalty, could not satisfy these rising dreams of ethnic nationalism. The assassination of Archduke Francis Ferdinand in Sarajevo in 1914 was the spark that ignited this powder keg, plunging Europe into the First World War. The war became the empire's death struggle. After 4 years of catastrophic loss, defeat was inevitable. In November 1918, as armies collapsed and cities declared independence, the last Habsburg ruler, Emperor Charles I, was persuaded to renounce participation in state affairs. He did not formally abdicate, hoping to preserve a legal claim, but it made no difference. The republics of Austria and Hungary were proclaimed, and the vast Austro-Hungarian Empire was dissolved, shattered into the new nations of Central Europe. Charles I went into exile, dying in poverty on the Portuguese island of Madeira in 1922. His hopes of restoration dashed. With him died the last vestige of Habsburg political rule. The family that had once dictated the fate of continents was now stateless, its members scattered across the globe. Today, the descendants of the Habsburgs are citizens, not monarchs. They are historians, businessmen, artists, and European parliamentarians. The current head of the family, Karl von Habsburg, lives in Austria and advocates for European unity and cultural heritage. They carry the famous name and a profound historical legacy, but they hold no political power. The dynasty's end was not a single dramatic explosion, but a slow unraveling. First biological, then political. The curse of the jaw did not cause the First World War, but it had crippled the dynastic core centuries earlier, making the Habsburg state a magnificent but brittle vessel. When the great waves of modern history finally hit, that vessel, already weakened from within by its own ancient choices, broke apart completely. Their story closes not with a bang, but with a quiet exile, a reminder that even the most carefully constructed empires are ultimately subject to the relentless currents of time and the unforeseen consequences of their own founding logic. The story of the Habsburg Jaw is more than a royal tragedy. It is a timeless lesson written in bone. It shows us with brutal clarity how a social policy, pursued with the best short-term intentions, can unleash consequences that echo for centuries. The Habsburgs did not set out to deform their children. They were making rational political decisions to secure borders and consolidate power. Yet, by insisting on a closed system, they guaranteed a biological dead end. This pattern repeats wherever groups prioritize purity over diversity, whether in isolated human communities or in the management of endangered species. A population of animals confined to a small reserve, breeding only amongst themselves, faces the same grim math. Their gene pool shrinks, harmful recessive traits emerge, and the entire group becomes vulnerable to disease and extinction. The principle is universal. Genetic diversity is not a luxury, it is the bedrock of resilience. Our modern understanding of heredity has given us the tools to diagnose the past. We can now look at a 400-year-old portrait and see not just a king's likeness, but a genetic family tree and a medical chart. We have learned to read the symptoms in the curve of a jaw or the description of an illness, allowing us to offer posthumous diagnoses that would have been pure magic to the people who lived those lives. This transforms how we see history. The fates of kings and the fall of empires are no longer just tales of battles and treaties. They are also stories of biology, of environment, of unseen forces shaping the visible world. The Habsburgs teach us that history and science are not separate subjects on a shelf. They are two lenses focused on the same human story, and when we look through both, the picture becomes astonishingly clear. Our own choices today about community, health, and how we relate to one another are writing the genetic and historical narratives of tomorrow. What invisible consequences might we be setting in motion, and what lessons from the past can help us see them before it is too late? The final diagnosis may always remain just beyond our reach. While science has proven the link between inbreeding and the deformity, the specific genetic mutations responsible have never been pinpointed. A definitive answer would require something extraordinary: permission to test the ancient DNA of the Habsburgs themselves. Imagine extracting genetic material from the tooth of Charles II in the crypt of El Escorial, or from the remains of Philip IV in Vienna. Modern sequencing could, in theory, scan those centuries-old genomes for the exact errors that disrupted their facial development. It could settle the debate between mandibulofacial dysostosis and hormonal disorders once and for all. But such a study faces immense ethical and practical hurdles. These are not anonymous skeletons in a lab. They are the entombed founders of nations, resting in places of deep cultural and religious significance. The decision to disturb them for science is not taken lightly, so the precise genetic signature of the Habsburg Jaw remains a ghost in the machine, a known effect in search of its ultimate molecular cause. This single mystery opens a door to a much larger historical frontier. How many other afflictions of the past, chalked up to divine punishment or bad luck, might have hidden genetic explanations? Consider the strange, debilitating illness of England's King Henry VIII in his later years, with its painful leg ulcers and dramatic mood swings. Could there be an underlying hereditary disorder behind the tyrant's torment? Or the profound melancholy and physical collapse of Mary, Queen of Scots, during her long imprisonment? Was it purely political despair, or did a genetic predisposition to severe depression run in her family, the Stuarts? The list of potential cases stretches across centuries. The royal madness of various monarchs, the repeated miscarriages and infant deaths that plagued so many courts, the peculiar physical traits that defined certain noble houses. All of these could be threads leading back to our shared and often misunderstood biological inheritance. The Habsburgs offer a powerful template. They show us how to read history with a genetic lens, to look at a portrait or a historical account and ask a new kind of question. What if that wasn't a curse but a chromosome? What if that wasn't weakness of character but a weakness written in DNA? This approach turns the past into a vast, unsolved crime scene, where the clues are in the bones, the paintings, and the long-forgotten symptoms described in dusty letters. Every dynasty that practiced strict endogamy, from the Ptolemaic pharaohs to the royal houses of Hawaii, becomes a candidate for its own hidden genetic narrative. Their stories remind us that history is not just the record of what people did, but also of what they biologically were, and that the two are forever and fascinatingly intertwined. Look at the face of Maximilian I. The founder of the dynasty's fortune stares out with a strong, determined gaze. His jaw is prominent, yes, but it speaks of authority, not yet deformity. The inbreeding coefficient here is low, a mere 0.05. The genetic gamble has just begun. Now see his grandson, Charles V, emperor of half the known world. The jaw has pushed forward, the lower lip grows heavier, the coefficient climbs to 0.08. The family strategy is working brilliantly on the political map, but a faint shadow now falls across the royal face. Move to his son, Philip II of Spain, the architect of empire, the ruler of gold fleets. His portrait shows the features hardening. The jaw is unmistakable, the lip full. The coefficient ticks upward again. The marital loops are tightening. Then his son, Philip III. The face is longer, narrower. The jaw is more pronounced. The eyes seem weary. The coefficient jumps to 0.11. The closed circle is now a visible weight. Next, Philip IV, immortalized by Velázquez in shadow and gold. Here is the Habsburg look in full flower. The protruding jaw, the everted lip, the sunken cheeks of maxillary deficiency. The coefficient reaches 0.13. The art is majestic, but the subject's biology tells a different story. And finally, we arrive at the end, Charles II, the child of a genetic dead end. The coefficient soars to an almost unimaginable 0.25. The portrait is heartbreaking. The jaw is grotesquely extended, the mouth hangs open, the eyes are distant and clouded with suffering. The upper face is collapsed, the entire structure of the skull seems pulled toward that one distorted point. In this rapid gallery, you have just witnessed the entire saga. The ambitious rise of a minor Swiss family, the brilliant, ruthless strategy of marriage within a tiny elite circle, the slow, invisible concentration of recessive genes with every signed wedding contract, and the ultimate visible price paid on the human face. The political empire expanded across the globe, but the biological one shriveled from within. From the formidable chin of a founding emperor to the tragic mask of a broken king, the line of portraits does not just show a family. It graphs a dynasty's fate, a curve that climbs to the heights of power and then plummets into the depths of genetic collapse. Every face in this gallery is a monument to a choice, and every choice carved itself into the bone of the next generation. From a peculiar chin to a parable of power, the Habsburg jaw reveals a story far deeper than bone. It is a tale where political genius collided with biological ignorance, where the quest for a pure dynasty forged its own instrument of decay. We have traced this journey from a minor Swiss castle to the throne rooms of a global empire, watching as a family's greatest strength, their relentless closed-circle marriages, became their fatal flaw. The portraits gave us the visual evidence, a gallery of increasingly distorted faces. Modern science provided the explanation, with the landmark 2019 study proving the undeniable link between the severity of the jaw and the rising coefficient of inbreeding. We saw how each strategic union, designed to lock down kingdoms and gold, was also a roll of the genetic dice, doubling down on hidden recessive traits until they manifested in the tragic figure of Charles II. The cost was measured in human suffering, in mumbled speech, in debilitating illness, in the psychological torment of rulers trapped in bodies that mocked their divine authority. And the final price was political, a sterile king, a war of succession, and an empire shattered. So what remains of this centuries-old curse? It stands as a stone-faced monument to a fundamental truth. No amount of wealth, no web of alliances, no belief in divine right can override the laws of nature. The Habsburgs, in their towering ambition to control continents and purify a bloodline, discovered that biology imposes the ultimate limits on human design. Their story is a permanent reminder that systems which close in on themselves, whether royal families or ideologies, do not preserve strength, they cultivate fragility. The jaw is their legacy, etched not just in history books, but in the very language of medicine and the cautionary tales we still tell today. Which part of this mystery stays with you? Was it the scientific detective work that decoded the portraits, the tragic human cost for kings like Charles II, or the profound irony that their political master plan contained the seeds of its own destruction? Let us know in the comments below, and if you want to join us as we unravel more of history's greatest puzzles, be sure to subscribe.